Hello everyone, welcome to Cloud World. Today's video we are going to do a follow-up for the DAPR topic, and in this case we are going to explore a new implementation using Azure Event Hub. We are going to see this locally, how to execute it locally consuming the Azure resources, and after that we are going to make a quick deployment to the Azure portal and also to explore the same application running on the Azure Container Apps. So okay, this is going to be a very interesting lab. We are going to do a lot of hands-on, so let's get started. So on the last video, we deployed our application locally using the DAPR tooling. But for the pub sub architecture, we use a Redis cluster locally just to make everything pretty simple. So back then, what happened is that the DAPR API was actually constructing a Docker container using Redis in order to make the pub sub. That was pretty simple, and actually you can use Redis also in the Azure side or mostly any other cloud provider where you can deploy DAPR. Remember that you can deploy DAPR in any infrastructure that support Kubernetes manually or by using self-hosted tools like the Azure Container Apps. So for the change today, we are actually going to move back to the Azure Event Hub. And in this case, we are updating the pub sub architecture design in order to connect to that Event Hub. There are a couple of things that changed drastically from the last version when we used Redis. In this case, we need to specify that the type of our components will be pub sub Azure.Event Hubs. Remember that there are a lot of components that are supported throughout the DAPR infrastructure, like Event Hubs, Service Bus, and storage queues, and also other services that can be used to store the state of the application and things like that. So for this Event Hub, we only need to provide the namespace. The version for this will be v1. And there are three important things that we need to specify in here in order to start working. The first thing will be the Azure Event Hub namespace. We only need to provide the scan the name. And there is two additional things that work together that you need to create. You will need to provide an Azure storage account in order to store the checkpoints for the Azure Event Hub that work together with the DAPR consumer. This is especially important when you deploy the application to the Azure side, because DAPR is going to use that storage account at that particular container in order to store something that is named as the checkpoints in order to follow up the state of the application. From here, we only need to provide a consumer ID, and in this case, this is going to match the Event Hub and the consumer group that we defined for the Event Hub instance. So pretty simple. Remember that for everything that we are doing, we are using integrated authentication with Azure resources. So that means locally, I am using my Azure account to access any resources, and when we deploy the application to the Azure portal, we are using managed identities. So for running this, I am assuming that the Event Hub that you created from the past videos already have the RBAC assigned for your user locally in order to be able to execute it. If you want to deploy that to the Azure portal, it's the same. The managed identity must have the permissions to be able to execute it. Otherwise, you can provide the connection string for all these services using the key and the full configuration. But as I mentioned on the past videos, especially when we spoke about managed identities, I strongly suggest to not interact with Azure services with keys, but instead using RBAC when it's available. So for that, let's take a look into the execution locally. Okay, now to execute our solution locally, it doesn't change too much. If you remember, we have a DAPR.yaml, which is going to contain the definition for our application, and in this case, it's going to be the consumer and the producer. Remember, the consumer has a port exposed. In this case, it will be the port 5006 on my local environment, and this port is actually very important because DAPR is going to contact our application in the same port. So remember that this is very important to keep in mind. Beyond that, we have the same configuration as before. We have the resource path that is in the component folder, and the component folder holds our pub sub YAML, which is going to connect to the Event Hub. From there, things doesn't change too much. So let's execute this locally and see how it runs. Okay, so let's execute our application locally. What is going to happen in here is that our producer is going to be sending those messages to the Event Hub, and the consumer eventually is going to get also those messages from the Event Hub too. So our pub sub architecture in the middle is now using this Event Hub in order to interact with one to each other. So as you can see, we already got all the messages that are being sent from the producer into the consumer pretty flawlessly. If we take a sneak peek into the Azure portal, we will be able to see exactly the same behavior when we deploy the application. Right now, so we are going to be deploying our application. So initially we will be doing very standard configuration in here. As always, we will be building our images for the DAPR components and pushing those into the ACR. We are already very familiar with these commands. We worked with them in the past. We are providing also a storage account, which is required for the checkpoints like I mentioned previously. And for that, we are using also the managed identity in order to give the proper access to the storage account. The important part comes in here when we create the component. Because we already have a container app environment, we need to set up something that is a DAPR component. So the DAPR component that we would like to specify in this case, it will be the Azure Event Hub. So for the name, we are going to provide in the same name that our code is already using, poop soup. For the environment name, we use, of course, the one that already exists, but the most important piece, it will be the YAML that we need to provide as an input for our application. This YAML is actually pretty similar to the one what we saw for the local configuration, because we need to provide the component type, the version, and also the metadata with the consumer ID, the storage account configuration, and the event hub. The important piece in here is that we need to provide the Azure client ID, and in this case you need to provide the client ID for your managed identity to make it work properly on the Azure side. Beyond that, remember to specify the scopes. This is the name of the application that will be able to interact with this component on your application. With that, we will deploy the both applications into the container app. The important things to mention besides the usual configuration is that our container app are going to have DAPR enabled. One of them will be, of course, the consumer, and the consumer is going to be listening in the port 8080 for the DAPR side. So remember, DAPR is going to be sending any messages that arrive to the event hub throughout the middleware using the port 8080 to our application. Each application specifies which port is actually going to use. So if you remember, in the local environment, we use the port 5006, and in the container app, we are using the port 8080, which is specified in the Docker file. Beyond that, we need to, of course, the access to the managed identity as well, and the other part is actually a very straightforward configuration that we already done in the past. For the consumer, we need to do something pretty similar, just to enable DAPR, give an ID to our application, and specify that the DAPR protocol is going to be HTTP. Since our application is not going to be receiving any messages from the DAPR middleware when deployed, we don't need to open a port in this case to contact the application. So I'm going to execute this, and we are going to explore also the solution after the deployment on the Azure portal. Now if we go to the Azure portal, we will be able to see a couple of things in here. The first thing is that if we go to our container app environment, we will be able to see the DAPR component that was created in here. So this is the poop soup component. So as you can see, we have the basic configuration. We have the name, we have the component type, the version, and we also have the metadata in here that we specify throughout the configuration. Something pretty simple. So with this, we can take a look into the container app producer as well, and we will see that in the DAPR blade, DAPR has been enabled. The app ID is the DAPR producer and is using the HTTP protocol for communication. I'm going to do a hard refresh because usually this panel doesn't display the information at first, something pretty strange. But if we do a reset, we will be able to see that our component is tied to the poop soup design. If we go to the log stream for the container, we will be able also to see some of the logs, and we will be able to check that the application has been sending messages properly throughout the application. So now let's take a look into the consumer. Now if we go into the consumer, we also will be able to see that we have DAPR enabled in here. The DAP ID will be DAPR consumer for the application ID. The app port that we have exposed is the 8080 throughout the HTTP protocol. And also it is tied to the component, but as I said, it's not actually working properly. So let's do a hard refresh very quickly to this one. And now we will see that also we have the poop soup. At the same level, if we go into the log stream and we take a look into what has been written into the container, we will be able to see that also the messages are arriving in here successfully, and our consumer is taking those messages from the event hub. Just as a sneak peek, we can also see that besides the application container that we created, we also have the DAPR sidecar, as I mentioned on the first video about DAPR. And the sidecar is that part of the component which is going to create that communication between the environment that we are running everything and the DAPR infrastructure. So well, As you can see, building DAPR application using Azure resources is actually pretty easily. You can do it with a basic configuration and almost little no code in your application to exchange those messages, and deploying those is also pretty easy. Azure Container Apps makes this pretty flexible and easy to do, thanks for all the tooling that is available to it. I hope you like this video. See you in the next one.